There's a grand, imposing building sitting on its very own island, surrounded by a moat in East Sussex. And from the moment that skeptic Chris Tuckett, the live-in property manager and caretaker, stepped foot inside the centuries-old Michelham Priory, something felt off. For weeks, he was plagued with relentless paranormal activity that seemed hell-bent on driving him out of his new home. Strange sounds, mysterious crying, and even apparitions would appear when he was least expecting it. Michelham Priory seemed to be testing him, pushing him to his limits, and the house almost won. But instead of running, Chris made a stand and came to an agreement with whatever it was that resides within the walls of Michelham Priory. But that doesn't mean that the activity stopped. In fact, some people claim that Michelham Priory is one of the most haunted buildings in the UK. And when you dive into the centuries of turbulent history and otherworldly reports being witnessed to this day, you can start to understand why many people may think that. But who are these seemingly multiple entities haunting the old priory? Why are they still there? And how are they continuing to make their presence known? Obviously, while the house that stands on the site today does look very old, and I mean it is, it wasn't the first building there, because believe it or not, there is a lot of history to this one. So if we go all the way back to the beginning of the records that we have on that site, there was initially a Saxon church here, but in 1229, the Augustinian Priory of the Holy Trinity was founded here by a guy called Gilbert of L'Aigle, and even though it was initially home to just 13 canons, the priory would have played this pivotal role in the community. It was obviously a holy place, a place of worship, as well as a place where canons would have lived, learned and worked. And when I say canons, I don't mean like cannon gun cannons. They're basically like a monk, a holy person, but they follow the rule of St. Augustine. Unlike monks though, who lead more of a contemplative lifestyle, canons do work for the local community, preaching, teaching, all that sort of stuff. Gilbert didn't actually hold on to the property for too long though, as in 1235, he actually had to forfeit all of his lands and titles as kind of like a slap on the wrist for heading off to Normandy without the green light from the king of the time, Henry III. The priory itself wasn't necessarily in the good books of the Catholic higher-ups either. It was constantly being visited by inspectors from the church and getting fined for less than devout behaviour from the canons, because there was actually a pub that sat by the gatehouse to the priory, so the only way in and out because of the moat, and so apparently the canons were regulars, shall we say. There's no recorded evidence of anything other than them enjoying a tipple or 20, but some stories that have been passed down through word of mouth say that some canons would party hard, live loudly, and pursue the local maidens, you know, all those things that men of the cloth probably shouldn't do. The canons continued to live and work at the priory, although by the 14th century, things were only getting worse. The Black Death swept through the country and apparently hit Michelham Priory particularly hard, and by 1353, it was recorded that there wasn't actually enough canons there to fulfill its obligations. There just weren't enough people to maintain the upkeep of the property, as well as their role in the community. And by 1398, the priory was kind of sitting in ruins. It was in a really bad state, because not only had the canons been a little less than completely loyal to their duties, they'd also lost people in the Black Plague, but also people would come into Michelham Priory, canons in charge or other important people, and kind of just take what they could away from the place. Anything valuable that they could skim off the top and wouldn't cause too much of a fuss, that was going in their pockets. Just a little bit here and a bit of that there, like over and over again over the decades, and it had all just gradually contributed to the decline of the priory. But that was obviously nothing compared to 1537, when Michelham Priory was seized under Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, which was a series of royal decrees which ordered the systematic closure and destruction of places of Catholic worship. And then, of course, the funneling of all of that wealth into establishing the Church of England. But for Michelham Priory in particular, the building and everything in it was given to Henry's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell. He didn't get to enjoy it for too long, as in 1540, he'd fallen out of favour with the king already, because Henry held Thomas personally responsible for encouraging him to marry his fourth wife, Anne of Cleves, who King Henry was infamous for saying how he felt misled by her portraits, how he wasn't attracted to her, and so promptly had to go through the whole thing about getting another divorce. And so while it wasn't specifically treason, Henry felt betrayed by Thomas, and that was enough to remove his head. The estate was then sold on, the Church of the Holy Trinity was destroyed, and the building was turned into a Tudor manor house, where it again continued to be sold and chopped and changed through the years. In 1601, the first Earl of Dorset, Thomas Sackville, he bought the priory, although there's no evidence to suggest that he ever lived there. Similarly to a lot of wealthy wealthy landowners of the time, it's likely that he would have just rented out Michelham Priory to tenants as just a way of generating even more wealth. When he died, the property passed down to his eldest son Robert, who on his death passed it down to his son, and so on through the Sackville family. There was talk that in 1798 one of the shepherds was obviously having a grand old time with his mates, possibly had been drinking in the Gatehouse pub that night, and his mates had bet him that he couldn't swim across the moat. Hold my beer. However, he wasn't able to do it, and apparently he drowned in the moat and died. In the 19th century, the estate was sold out of the Sackville family, and it carried on changing hands. In the early 20th century, there was a series of fires which damaged the building, but it was thankfully restored by an architect called Walter Godfrey. Michelham Priory also had an important part to play in the Second World War too, as it was used as a base for Canadian soldiers over the winter of 1941 into 1942, as they prepared for the Dieppe raid. And if you know, you know. But if you don't, the Dieppe raid was pretty much labelled as a complete failure. It happened on the 19th of August 1942, where 4,963 Canadians were deployed to the German-occupied port of Dieppe. Only 2,210 returned to England, and many of those were wounded. The Germans took almost 2,000 prisoners of war, and 916 Canadian soldiers had died. And so while the raid was useful for gathering intel on later raids like the D-Day landings, it all came at a very high cost, and so potentially some of the men that stayed at Michelham did not come back alive. During the Second World War, the Priory was also used to house evacuees, so children escaping the Blitz in London. And then after the war in 1958, a woman called Stella Hotblack bought Michelham Priory because she wanted to preserve the building and save it for future generations to enjoy. And then on the 1st of November 1959, she put the Priory in a trust and gave it to the Sussex Archaeological Society, who still own and run the place now, opening it up to the public as a museum at Michelham Priory House and Gardens. And I don't know about you, that history just felt like a bit of a whirlwind, right? Just me? I felt a bit like I was Bob Hale from Horrible Histories on the Michelham Priory report, jumping from one owner to the next in a whistle-stop tour through around about 800 years of history.
But not for long!
But the bottom line is, throughout the centuries that Michelham Priory has stood, from the misbehaving canons to the dissolution of the monasteries, the world wars, the fires, and inevitably the deaths from generations of families living and dying here, whether they owned it or they rented it, it has had a long and turbulent life. So obviously I'm talking about it right now, so of course it is rumoured to be haunted. But the first ghost I'm going to tell you about has nothing to do with the building that stands there today, because allegedly the apparition of the last Saxon king, Harold II, appears at Michelham Priory, and he's seen on the grounds and he walks off in the vague direction east, and it's thought that he's heading off to Battle Abbey, which is the site of the Battle of Hastings, where in 1066 King Harold was killed and William the Conqueror became England's new ruler. But of course we're talking about a haunted priory, and you can't have a haunted priory without some ghostly hooded monks, can you? Well, technically hooded canons, but you get what I mean. There is one particular hooded figure who's seen in the Undercroft, and he's potentially also been seen in the kitchens and wandering around the Gatehouse too. And it's not exactly clear how we know, but some people say that this particular figure is John Leam, who was the head honcho at the Priory between 1374 and 1417. And by all accounts, he was one of the good ones. He was remembered as being quite a kind and benevolent person, no extreme drunkenness or chasing local maidens around. And there was a story in David Scanlan's book, Paranormal Sussex, where potentially David himself may have even had an encounter with this apparition of John Leam. He was there in 2004 investigating the Priory with the Hampshire Ghost Club, and as he was walking through the Undercroft, he was on his own, and he'd just got to where the staircase is, and at the bottom of the stairs he sees the figure of a man in his robes. The pair stood facing each other silently until the apparition raised his hand and pointed up the stairs, and then proceeded to shout in a very loud booming voice, and those of a sensitive nature, please cover your ears now. He said, and I quote, "He is a fucking sick bastard," before vanishing into thin air right in front of David. He was still rooted to the spot, quite unable to believe what had just happened, when one of the other investigators came around the corner. It was literally seconds after this had just happened, and the shout was so loud that there's no way that this investigator wouldn't have heard these ghostly canons' expletives. So David asked, "Did you just hear that shouting?" To which they replied, they didn't hear a thing. John may also appear with a group of his colleagues at Michelham Priory, as on multiple occasions, the figures of about 3 canons have been seen walking throughout the Priory. But what's really interesting is that they've been seen walking down an invisible staircase in one of the rooms, where centuries ago there had been a staircase. And with Michelham Priory, it was a private house from 1537 onwards, which is hundreds more years of history that had nothing to do with its time as a religious building. And so with that comes more ghost stories from its time as a private house. Probably the most famous ghost, although it's really interesting that he's the most famous, but there you go. Thomas Sackville, the guy who took on Michelham Priory from 1601, he's said to haunt the building, regardless of the fact that, yeah, he probably visited his property, but he never lived there. He's also apparently not a very nice entity, both to the living and the dead. He's thought to be responsible for going around and pinching ladies' bums. That's how he seems to be entertaining himself in the afterlife. And he also apparently chases around another entity, a little girl who psychic mediums have picked up on called Rosie. And she's seen wearing all ragged, tattered clothing, and she's got a little ribbon in her hair. And she also tries to hide away from Thomas in a priest hole at the top of the stairs. It's like a little hideaway behind the wood panelling. I couldn't find if anyone has actually seen Rosie or Thomas in passing, or whether they had both just been picked up by psychic mediums. And then from that, the story just gets told and retold. So, you know, there's a bit of a pinch of salt to be had there. But there are a few other seemingly more harmless entities who you may come across at the Priory who have apparently been seen by just regular people who aren't psychic mediums, including the gold standard for a haunted house, a grey lady. And her story, it seems to have got all sorts of mixed up. Maybe they're multiple separate ghosts, most likely there are a bunch of different versions of her story, but the grey lady is a tall, thin woman who is seen sometimes within the gatehouse, other times around the bridge over the moat, and she'll be staring desperately into the water as if she's searching for something. Sometimes though, she's said to appear in the middle of the night, and this must have been back when Michelham Priory was a private house or when people were sleeping there, and allegedly guests would wake up in the middle of the night to find her standing over them in their bed, and she's staring down at them before turning away and disappearing through a wall. And she's seen wearing a long grey dress, and she is almost always accompanied by a really strong floral perfumey scent. And as to who she is, this is where it gets a bit murky. She could be the ghost of a woman in the 1730s who allegedly fell down the stairs in the gatehouse and broke her neck. There are other versions of the story that say that she was a member of the Sackville family, and she watched absolutely helpless as either her son or daughter tragically drowned in the moat, and that after the loss of her child, she killed herself so that she could be with them. But there's a different version that says that she wasn't part of the Sackville family, which would make sense, as similarly with Thomas, I'm not sure any of the Sackvilles actually lived there, but instead she was a woman from the Children family. Their last name was Children, which I'd never heard of. I know Childs is a surname, but I've never heard the surname Children before. Anyway, she was actually a tenant of the Sackville family, so her family were renting Michelham Priory off the Sackvilles. And we know that it would have been around this time because their graves are actually in the St. Pancras churchyard, about 10 minutes away. And the story goes that her 5-year-old son was out playing in the moat, or playing around the moat, when his clothes got caught in the watermill that's on the property, and he was tragically strangled. And so now this grey lady appears, constantly searching for her son in the water. There is also apparently another woman who's said to haunt the grounds of Michelham Priory. She's a middle-aged woman, sometimes seen in broad daylight outside, wearing a tweed suit that looks to be early 1900s, and she's walking a small terrier on a lead. And there was one time in 1972, so once the building was a museum and there were guests lining up to get tickets, when the figure of this woman in tweed walked past the queue with her dog. Someone in the queue shouted up to her like, excuse me, dogs aren't allowed in the museum? And where do you think you're going? You can't cut in line. But without even acknowledging them, she just disappeared. But if you don't see the echo of ghostly ladies on the bridge, you might instead see a man galloping full pelt across the bridge towards the house on a horse with a pure white coat. And allegedly, this same horse has been witnessed in the stables too, as one of the Priory's last private owners, before it was handed over to be a museum, actually complained about this ghostly horse, saying that it had been scaring his horses. Could you even imagine the meltdown that paranormal investigators around the world would be having if a ghost horse appeared in front of them? And here this guy is grumbling about the inconvenience this phantom horse is causing. I don't know, I just find stories like that really funny. But inside the house, there is so much activity allegedly going on. The kitchen seems to be a particularly active spot, with some witnesses claiming to see a young boy running around here. Could he have potentially been a kitchen hand at some point in time? There's also been 2 cooks seen at separate times. The first one was a woman who was standing near to the fireplace, and the second was a man, and this man was apparently seen by one of the guides at the museum. He was being interviewed by the Queen, Michaela Strachan, for the TV show Great British Ghosts, and he said that he'd seen the figure of a man, and he was quite portly, had a red face, presumably from working over the fire, big old Popeye forearms, and he was completely solid. Could have looked like one of those costume actors that museums sometimes hire. He had a knife in his hand and he was cutting away strips of meat from whatever was being cooked on the fire when he stopped to have a conversation with this guide. It would be really interesting to know if anyone else has seen this figure though, as I could only find this one particular guide talking about him. There may even be some sort of ghostly echoes at Michelham Priory from its time during World War II, as a man wearing a brown military uniform has been seen, which would have been what the Canadian soldiers were wearing while they were stationed here. Apparently a woman wearing 1940s clothing has also been seen, so I don't think she was in actual uniform, and also the sounds of children laughing and playing were heard in the rooms where the London evacuees would have been staying. And so with a lot of these stories, it seems like if you're gonna have a paranormal encounter, you might just see a residual echo of someone. A woman in Tudor clothing who's known as the Blue Lady, she's been seen walking down those same invisible stairs that the group of canons came down. And there's also been a maid seen around the main staircase, which psychic mediums have allegedly picked up on and said that she possibly fell down the stairs or was pushed over the banister for some reason. And one of the managers of Michelham Priory, a Lindsay Lawrence, she said that she was on her own one day just cleaning up when she happened to just hear a noise behind her. She turned, obviously expecting a colleague or someone to be there, when she saw this weird haze in just the vague general shape of a tall man standing behind her for about 30 seconds before he disappeared. And getting a bit more unnerving, a dark shadow with glowing red eyes has been spotted. A kid once came running out of the public toilet block screaming and crying, saying that a man with a long neck had leaned over into the cubicle to look at her. So obviously the mom immediately went into the toilets to see who it was. There was no one else in there. But the one I really didn't like the sound of took place on the staircase. Because you'll be walking up the stairs, no one else is up there, and you just so happen to look up and see a face peering down at you from between the banisters. And as soon as you see it, it will duck out of sight. And I don't know why, that gives me the creeps more than the dark shadow with glowing red eyes or the terrifyingly described long neck man. But the thought that you're walking up the stairs and you know you're alone, there's no one up there, and you see a pale ghostly face staring right at you. Like, what are you gonna do? Do you keep going up the stairs towards the owner of said face? I'm not sure I would. But all of this strangeness has been witnessed by guests, by staff, paranormal investigators, just people passing through the building on no particular day. But by far, it seems like Chris Tuckett knows more about the ghosts than anyone, as much as he probably wouldn't like to think about it, because he took the job as a live-in property manager at Michelham Priory, which, I mean, ghosts aside, there are worse living accommodations you can find yourself in. And he was a full-on skeptic when he first arrived, but almost immediately after moving in, the house seemed to come alive with activity. He'd chosen an upstairs area to set up a little flat for himself, but obviously it wasn't furnished or anything like that. And so your first port of call is to make the space habitable, right? Moving in your furniture and things. Chris claimed that he felt this really strange, dark energy in the building. And whenever he'd make a change to the flat, move in more furniture or whatnot, he'd feel that dark energy become more intense, more oppressive. Vibes just aren't right. But he carries on. I mean, this is his job now. He needs somewhere to live and he doesn't believe in ghosts really, so a bit of a strange gut feeling isn't going to put him off. Until the activity kicked up a notch. One evening, after he'd locked up and set the security alarms and was making his way up to his flat, he started hearing a woman crying. And he's fairly new at this point. Maybe he didn't scout the entire building before locking up. Maybe this visitor was just too engrossed in the museum and didn't realise the time, and now they're locked in and panicking. Okay, it kind of sounds reasonable. He goes back downstairs, following the sounds of the woman crying, but he can't find her. Every time he goes into a new room where he thinks the crying is coming from, the sound moves like it's just in the next room, and then the next and the next. Eventually, at some point, he calls it. There's no way that he wouldn't have come across this woman at some point. Even if she is panicking and running from room to room, he would have bumped into her by now. So he just kind of gives up and goes back to his bedroom. The woman's crying lasts for hours and keeps him up at night because it is so loud. He's not even a week into this job, wondering what on earth he's got himself into, but it gets worse. One night he's asleep in bed when he's woken up to the sounds of loud banging, almost like furniture scraping on the floor. Immediately, he nopes out of it, covers himself in the duvet. This is not happening, this is a morning problem, thanks very much. But the noises don't stop, and he's lying there under the covers. There's no hope of going back to sleep now. He decides he needs to go and see what's going on. So he gets out of bed and goes into the next room, which is his living room. The banging and scraping stops, but he sees that his big heavy writing bureau that he most definitely placed against the wall has been pulled out a good couple of feet. Right, it's on casters, so uneven floors, maybe, right? Slim maybe, but maybe. He walks over to it to go and push it back into place when he looks down at the floor and he sees a figure of 8 that has been scratched into the wood by one of the casters seizing up. So whatever it was moving the bureau in a figure of 8 motion. That's a little harder to logic away. He tries to go about his normal life, doing his duties, looking after the priory, all while strange things are still happening all around him. And I mean, the guy is trying to settle into a new job and a new house, let alone all of this. But eventually, it just gets too much. He contemplates just sacking it all off, going and finding a new job, moving out and just leaving it all behind. But he doesn't. Instead, a couple of weeks after moving in, he sat at the bottom of the main staircase and started talking. Not to anyone in particular, he didn't specifically say the ghosts. He said he was talking to the house, which, fair enough. He goes on to say that, look, clearly, I know you're seemingly not happy with me, you're testing me, trying to drive me out, I get it. I'm not here to make waves, I'm not here to paint your timber frames millennial grey and throw a live, laugh, love up on the wall. In fact, I'm here for the opposite. I'm here as a caretaker, I'm here to look after the place, I'm here to just try and preserve the building and keep it standing. I'm not trying to get in your face, in fact, I kind of want the opposite. So if you're cool and you leave me alone, I'm cool and I'm more than happy to leave you alone. And after that, the dark energy seemed to fade a little bit, and Chris carried on living at Michelham Priory. But just because he gave the house a talking to, doesn't mean that the weird activity completely stopped. One night he had again just done his rounds and locked up, and it was about 11:30 at night, and he started walking up the stairs towards his flat. He just so happened to look up to see a man with black hair and a long coat walking down the stairs. I don't think this figure acknowledged him, but Chris was just absolutely stunned, and after the man had passed him, he legged it up the stairs into his living area, where he met his partner, who was in absolute hysterics. She was absolutely inconsolable because she had just woken up to see a man with black hair and wearing a long coat leaning over her as she was lying in the bed, and he was holding some lavender above her, which is a really interesting detail because this is similar to something that people would have done in the past. Lavender was used to cleanse and purify a space, promote healing in a person, all of these things from the medieval times. So perhaps Chris's partner woke up just as he was finishing this ritual, and she was there freaking out, but he was already on his way out of the bedroom and down the stairs when he passed Chris there. Just super strange all around. But even if you don't see anything at Michelham Priory, that doesn't mean that weirdness isn't going on around you. Poltergeist activity seems to be reasonably common here, common in the context of a genuine unexplainable event at least. But windows open and close by themselves, even when there is no wind or draft to push them. Doors will slam shut when no one is in that area. Whether or not that's got anything to do with the windows or not, I don't know. And in the late 90s, when the BBC were doing some filming in the Undercroft, they'd finished washing all of the wigs and things that they were going to need the next day and just laid them all out to dry. Just locked the door for the night and that was that. But when they opened the Undercroft the next morning, all of the wigs had been messed up and thrown around the floor. One phenomena that was really interesting was that the loud ringing of a church bell has been heard on the property. And I mean, there is a church that is about half a mile away, so maybe it was that. But allegedly, the story goes that this particular church ringing heard within the priory is an echo from the bell that was sold when the priory was being broken down and sold for parts after the dissolution of the monasteries. Other visitors to the museum have had a really uneasy sense that they're being watched. Some report weird temperature drops that they can't explain, and then some unlucky visitors claim to feel like they're being pushed or hit by something that they can't see. And I can't talk about Michelham Priory without mentioning Most Haunted at least once, because while this episode was numbered like 15 or 16 in the first season, this was actually the first location that they'd ever filmed at for the pilot, the year before the season aired, and they'd loved it so much that they'd come back for their 100th episode. But I don't think you need the dulcet tones of good old Derek Acora channeling Thomas Sackville to make your own mind up about whether Michelham Priory is actually haunted or not. Because for me, I think there's got to be something going on there. It's always when a skeptic turns kind of almost maybe a believer, like Chris Tuckett, where he just cannot fathom a reasonable explanation for what he's experiencing. That makes me think, okay, yeah, they're probably somewhat more likely to be pretty rational about things. If they're being tormented enough by whatever's going on to sit at the bottom of the stairs and shout into nothingness that they want to be left alone, that's pretty compelling, right? Not to mention all of the history, everything that Michelham Priory has been through the centuries. I can absolutely believe that it is haunted. But please tell me your thoughts, let me know what you think. And if you enjoyed hearing about Michelham Priory, please do let me know by leaving this video a like. And if you fancy hearing more stories like this, maybe you want to subscribe too. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Over the winter of 1949 into 1942, 1949 into 1942. What is it with your numbers, Claire?